So there is real, incentive in terms of making higher profit going to Zambia. And that generates pressure on these guys who are operating in Zambia to work faster and also squeeze more from your workers. Now, another exceptional aspect of Chinese investment is that only the Chinese are doing this. And that is the government, the Chinese government, is doing what they call concessional loan projects. The Chinese would come up with a loan and to tell the Zambian government, I have this loan to build a road for you. Choose your road. You will have to pay back, but at no interest or very low interest. So the money comes from China. The Zambian government has to pay back in 20 or 30 years, very low interest or no interest sometimes, as a gift. So the stadium that we're seeing, they're building a stadium, national stadium, state-of-the-art stadium in Zambia as a gift, but it's also is a concessional loan, that is no interest. And the Chinese will choose their own company, the Chinese construction company, to do the project. So it's Chinese government money giving to Chinese company. So that this is the kind of construction projects that we see only the Chinese are doing. And whenever you see this kind of project, there will be a zone of exceptions. That is, there will be more exceptions given to the contractors who are building these. So for example, there will be no strike. There will be no or very little labor inspection during the course of these projects. And so the state-to-state part is really unique. And we haven't seen the South African governments. We have South African contractors on the ground, but the South African government hasn't gone out to provide this kind of concessional loan projects, and therefore there'll be no zone of exceptions for South African contractors. Now, I'm not, sorry, so I think I'll skip the copper mining segment. But basically the same. I've been to 3 kinds of mines, and we'll do the in-depth study later. But so far, and I'm going out on a limb here, is based on my preliminary interviews with some of these managers and workers. I'm seeing similar regime of production in the mining industry as well, and very similar to the construction industry. See all the strikes. And what is different in terms of the Chinese in the mining industry is that after the financial crisis in particular, we are seeing the Chinese expanding its investment. And not just expansion of investment in one industry, they are expanding in terms of moving out of mining to neighboring industry. So we are seeing, in Marxist terminology, we're seeing the concentration of capital as well as the centralization of capital. And this is very distinct. No other mining houses on the copper belt is expanding out of mining into manufacturing. So concentration of capital is happening with other companies as well, but the Chinese are also doing the centralization part, which is to diversify from mining into other related industry. And also we find that, part of the story is that time of the state, because in mining, the leader, the major driver of Chinese mining in Zambia is from the state. The capital is from the state. And actually that kind of capital has a different time frame than other kinds of foreign investors, because other kinds of foreign investors have to respond to Wall Street, have to respond to stockholders. But the Chinese capital, because it's state, it has a longer time frame. It can invest when people pull out. And so it's very different. And also, as part of that centralization argument, we are seeing the Chinese run special economic zone, and they promise in the zone, as I mentioned, that they promise that there will be manufacturing in addition to copper ore, smelting. So the zone represents this centralization of capital. Now, these are the special features of Chinese investments in copper mining. So if we put these two sectors together, I won't go into detail of comparing the and talking about the differences between these two sectors. But I like to come to the conclusion by highlighting what I find in terms of the similarities between these two sectors of Chinese investment to sort of answer going back to my original question, what is peculiar about Chinese capital? In labor-intensive industry, I think they have a peculiar group of workers that they can exploit. And those are surplus labor from China. China, because of the development in China, it has produced surplus capacities in many dimensions. And labor surplus is one of the things that we're seeing. That's why there's so much pressure on these workers and on the companies to move the labor out. On the labor itself, the managers, when we asked them, why would you accept this kind of ridiculously, slave-like condition of not being paid for 2 years? They said, well, yes, we don't get paid for 2 years, but the salary they get in Zambia is twice as much as what they get in China. And they said they desperately need that extra amount of salary because without that, they can't send their kids to school and they can't buy the increasingly expensive kind of property, housing, apartments for themselves. So we're talking about a labor pool that needs that extra income so that they can socially reproduce their labor power, their own labor power and the next generation. And the situation is very much like an ordinary migrant factory worker in China, where they have to go to the city because they need to reproduce their own labor power because the rural economy is going downhill in many parts of China. So the first thing to understand is there is extra exploitation going on in Chinese firms in Zambia, but it's not the exploitation on Zambian or African workers. It's the surplus labor that they bring with from China and they can control, and their exploitation really constitutes the 30% profit margin that they were able to secure compared to other competitors. So I think that's something that we have found that is interesting. And in capital-intensive industry, for example, mining, it's capital-intensive, so it's important for us to understand that capital in that kind of sector mostly come from the state, and that is state credit. Now here, I will have to spend more time over the next few years to look exactly into the relation between the banks and the corporations, how they control their personnel. I want to just flesh out a hypothesis or a conjecture that I have right now. And I'm seeing these kind of companies and the arrangement, the governments control credit. It looks to me like South Korea. The developmental state in South Korea basically disciplines big business by controlling credit. And I'm seeing these development banks, these policy banks in China, they are also controlling credit and try to use the credit to discipline these big businesses, which happen to be state-owned enterprises, centrally owned state-owned enterprises, and try to channel them into areas that the state considers strategically important. And so if there is anything special about this sector, the very capital-intensive sector, it is that we are seeing, maybe historically for the first time, that the late industrializer has reached a point where they're going abroad. And because of the Chinese economy, internal development of Chinese economy, they need to shed or restructure some part of the economy, the excess capacity they have built up over the past 30 years, and try to move that capacity to other parts of the world. And because, as a late industrializer, the rest of the world has been taken over, or the market of much of the rest of the world has been established or incorporated into European economies or American economies. And Africa is the last frontier in the sense that it is still relatively, I mean, US has abandoned Africa for 20 years, if not the last 10 years, where we have been more entangled with the Middle East and wars in different parts. And that's why the Chinese could have a foothold in Africa. And so I think the late industrializer argument is the one that I would try to pursue, both in terms of the character of capital, which is state-controlled credit, and the state is trying to steer it in ways that the state sees as important politically, but also economically. They are trying to build the manufacturing capacity of Africa so that Chinese-made machinery, and I'm seeing this going on in the construction business. Many of the construction firms that we talk to, South Africans, as well as Zambians, of course the Chinese, they import most of their heavy-duty equipments from China. And actually Zambians are going to China directly to buy machinery because they realize that they look at their Chinese competitors, they know they have machinery, they are cheaper than German-made kind of machinery or Japanese-made. So the market is open for construction machineries to go from China to Zambia, and also the copper manufacturing, the PARC, the Special Economic Zone, would likewise create a huge demand for excess capacity for heavy machinery to go from China to Zambia. And I think this is that kind of structural pressure that seems to me, or to suggest to me, that there's a real chance, a structurally induced chance, for Africa or Zambia at least, to break out of that single commodity export mode and really develop its manufacturing capacity, because China needs to export that kind of capacity somewhere else. And right now, if you look around, if you're a Chinese businessman and you want to have, to reap profit out of what you have produced, and you can't make as much profit in China, where would you go? Africa will be your real viable, economically viable market. And so it is this kind of structural demand imperative generated from within China, and given the global economic conditions currently, Africa becoming the only market that has not been occupied by more advanced industrialized economies. And that's why we're seeing this kind of, this avalanche of capital going there. So I think what I would need to do over the next few years is to take a look, more serious look at the mining and also at a special economic zone, and to trace back to the China Development Bank. How do they make those investment decisions, and the state's preference for which branch of industry they see as needed to be restructured outside of China to maintain certain kind of a certain level of social stability. Because when workers cannot find jobs, when workers can't earn enough to reproduce their own labor power, their family, support their family, when machineries are piling up and capital cannot make more profits, you have to deal with lots of social resistance and unrest. And the Chinese is trying to avoid that, I think, by exporting all these surplus capacities to the rest of the world. And right now, Africa seems to be the most logical kind of destination. My final point, and going back to why people on the ground, the Africans always complain about the Chinese and single out the Chinese. It has to do with the state-to-state patronage that the Chinese government has been doing, and trying to create that kind of conditions for Chinese capital to continue accumulate in Africa. The Chinese government has engaged African states. Their strategy is to talk to government. They avoid civil society. They don't want to talk to unions. The managers that I studied told me that it was in Zambia for the first time in their entire life. I mean, these are CEOs and managers in state-owned companies, centrally owned state-owned companies, and they told me that they've never sit across the bargaining table and talk to unions to negotiate salaries for their workers, but they have to do that in Zambia.